In the summer of 1857, inside Edinburgh's High Court of Justiciary, Scotland's Supreme Criminal Court, a 22-year-old woman stood accused of murder. Not just any murder. Triple murder. The Crown alleged she had methodically poisoned her lover with arsenic. Not once. Not twice. 3 separate times. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Love letters in her own handwriting, detailing their secret affair. Receipts showing she'd purchased arsenic, multiple times, in the weeks before his death. Medical testimony confirming massive quantities of the poison in his body. And yet, when the verdict came, it wasn't guilty. It wasn't innocent either. The jury returned something few outside Scotland had ever heard of: not proven. Legally equivalent to acquittal. Morally, something else entirely. Before we go further, if this kind of storytelling is what you have been looking for, the subscribe button is just below this video. We cover true crime from around the world, told with the detail and care it deserves. No sensationalism. No rushing through the facts. Just the full story, properly told. Hit subscribe, and you won't miss the next one. The spectators erupted. The press called her the most beautiful murderess in Britain. Madeleine Smith walked free from that courtroom, never to be convicted, but never to be cleared. The question that haunted Victorian Scotland, and still echoes today, wasn't just whether she did it. It was how she got away with it. Because to understand how it got there, we have to go back. To a city divided by class. To a love affair that broke every rule. And to a young woman who may have been Scotland's most brilliant killer, or its most tragic scapegoat. This is the story of Madeleine Smith. If you're not familiar with the United Kingdom's geography, Glasgow sits on Scotland's west coast, a massive port city that, by the mid-1850s, was the industrial engine of the British Empire. Cotton mills, shipyards, iron foundries working around the clock. It was Scotland's second largest city, and perhaps its most unequal. The working-class neighbourhoods near the River Clyde were overcrowded, unsanitary, and dangerous. Disease spread quickly. Life expectancy was shockingly low. But just a few streets away, in the elegant sandstone townhouses of Blythswood Square and the West End, Glasgow's merchant elite lived lives of extraordinary privilege. James Smith was a successful architect. Respectable. Church-going. Stern. He'd built a reputation designing villas for Glasgow's new money, and he expected his children, especially his daughters, to behave accordingly. His eldest daughter was Madeleine Hamilton Smith. Born March 29, 1835, Madeleine grew up in comfort. Private tutors. Piano lessons. Summers at the family's country estate. She was educated, articulate, and by all accounts, strikingly beautiful. Dark eyes, pale skin, a composed demeanor that made her the subject of considerable attention at church socials and dinner parties. In Victorian Scotland, a young woman of her class had one primary role: to marry well. Her father had already begun introducing her to eligible young men. Wealthy, respectable, boring, and Madeleine, outwardly the picture of obedience, was growing restless. He was 30 years old when they met in early 1855. A Jersey-born Frenchman, though Jersey is technically a British Crown dependency, a small island between England and France, who'd spent years traveling across Europe before settling in Glasgow. L'Angelier worked as a clerk in a shipping company. Respectable enough. But not wealthy. Not connected. Not the kind of man James Smith would ever permit his daughter to associate with, let alone marry. He was, however, charming. Dark-haired, well-dressed, romantic in the continental style. He spoke French. He wrote poetry. He had an intensity about him that many found magnetic, and others found slightly unsettling. He and Madeleine met by chance, on the street, near her home. What began as polite conversation became letters. The letters became secret meetings. The meetings became an affair. And here's where the world they inhabited becomes crucial to understanding what happened next. In 1850 Scotland, for a young woman of Madeleine's class, reputation was everything. A whisper of impropriety could destroy marriage prospects. An actual affair, especially a physical one, was social annihilation. There were no support systems for women who defied these rules. No safe way out. You either married the man, submitted to your family's choice, or faced ruin. For nearly 2 years, she conducted the affair in the shadows. Letters passed through servants. Late-night meetings at the barred window of her basement bedroom. Stolen hours when her family was away. The letters she wrote, more than 200 of them, were passionate. Explicit, by Victorian standards. She called him my pet, my own darling. She wrote about longing, about frustration, and about imagining their future together. But she also wrote something else. In several letters, she mentioned feeling trapped. Desperate. Afraid her father would find out. And then, in late 1856, everything shifted. Madeleine's family introduced her to William Minnick, a wealthy businessman, exactly the kind of match her father wanted. Minnick was polite, financially secure, appropriate. Madeleine accepted his courtship. But she didn't tell Emile L'Angelier. Not at first. When he found out, likely through mutual acquaintances, he was furious. He wrote demanding explanations, threatening to expose the affair, to show her letters to her father. Madeleine panicked. She tried to end things gently, then firmly, then desperately. L'Angelier refused to let go. In February 1857, Madeleine purchased arsenic from a pharmacy. She signed the register as required by Scottish law. She gave her name. She said it was for killing rats. 2 weeks later, she bought more. And then, on the night of March 22, 1857, Pierre Emile L'Angelier came home to his boarding house violently ill. By morning, he was dead. Emile L'Angelier spent that evening out. His landlady later recalled he left around 9 p.m., dressed well, carrying himself with his usual confidence. He didn't say where he was going. He returned just after midnight, and he was doubled over in pain. The landlady, Mrs. Jenkins, heard him stumbling up the stairs. She found him clutching his stomach, his face pale and slick with sweat. "I'm very ill," he told her. "Terribly ill." She helped him to his room, offered to call a doctor. He refused. "It will pass," he said. "It's happened before." And that detail, "it's happened before," would become crucial. Because this wasn't the first time Emile L'Angelier had suffered sudden, violent illness in recent weeks. He'd been sick in mid-February. Vomiting. Severe abdominal pain. He'd blamed it on food, on stress, on a weak constitution. He'd been sick again in late February. Same symptoms. Worse intensity. By dawn, his condition had deteriorated. He was vomiting continuously. Burning sensations in his throat and stomach. Severe cramping. Mrs. Jenkins called a doctor. Dr. Stephen arrived around 7 a.m. He examined L'Angelier and immediately suspected poisoning, though he couldn't say what kind. By 11 a.m., Emile L'Angelier was dead. He was 30 years old. The doctor ordered an autopsy. What the pathologist found was staggering. L'Angelier's stomach contained 82 grains of arsenic. To put that in context, 3 to 4 grains can be fatal. 82 grains wasn't just poisoning. It was overkill. But here's what made it even stranger. The distribution of the arsenic suggested it hadn't all been ingested at once. Some of it appeared older, partially absorbed. Some appeared fresh. The conclusion, Emile L'Angelier had been poisoned multiple times over several weeks, and someone had been feeding it to him gradually. Now, investigators had to answer a simple question: who? L'Angelier lived alone. He had no known enemies. He worked a quiet clerical job. He wasn't involved in gambling, criminal enterprises, or shady business dealings. He did, however, have a lover. When police searched his room, they found a small wooden box hidden beneath his bed. Inside, more than 200 letters. All from the same person. All signed Mimi. And all written by Madeleine Smith. The letters were intimate, passionate. In several, Madeleine explicitly described physical intimacy, language shocking for the time, especially from a woman of her class. But more damning than the passion was the timeline. The letters showed a clear narrative arc. Intense love and longing in 1855 and early 1856. Growing tension and conflict in late 1856. Desperation and attempts to break off the relationship in early 1857. And then, this is critical, several letters from February and March 1857 in which Madeleine tried to retrieve her earlier letters from Emile. She begged. She pleaded. She offered money. He refused. "These letters are my security," he'd written back. "If you leave me, the world will know what you are." Investigators also found entries in Emile's diary. On February 19th, he wrote, "Saw Mimi. Felt very ill after." On March 22nd, the night he died, he wrote only, "Mimi." No other details. Just her name. And now the police had a theory. Madeleine Smith had been having an affair. She'd wanted to end it to marry someone else. L'Angelier had threatened to expose her. She'd poisoned him, slowly at first, perhaps testing doses, and then fatally. They arrested her on March 31st, 1857, 9 days after Emile died. And that's when the real nightmare began. When Madeleine Smith was arrested, the story exploded across Britain. Newspapers called it the Arsenic cocoa case. Because according to the prosecution's theory, Madeleine had laced Emile's nightly cup of cocoa with arsenic during their secret meetings. The public was fascinated. A beautiful socialite. A doomed lover. Secret letters. Poison. It had everything. But the investigation, when you look closely, was far messier than the headlines suggested. Let's start with what the Crown had. The arsenic purchases. Madeleine had bought arsenic. That was undisputed. On February 21st, 1857, she purchased arsenic from a Glasgow chemist, signing the poison register as required by law. She gave her real name and address. On March 6th, she purchased more. On March 18th, again. Each time, she said it was for killing rats. Now, arsenic was commonly used for pest control in Victorian Scotland. But here's the problem. Madeleine lived in a well-maintained townhouse in one of Glasgow's best neighborhoods. Did they have rats? Possibly. Did they have an infestation requiring 3 separate arsenic purchases in 4 weeks? That seemed unlikely. And there was another issue. Arsenic sold for pest control was legally required to be mixed with soot or indigo dye, a safety measure to prevent accidental ingestion and to make poisoning harder to disguise. But the arsenic found in Emile's stomach was pure. No soot. No dye. Which meant either 1. Madeleine had somehow refined it, possible but difficult, or 2. She'd obtained pure arsenic from another source. No evidence of this was ever found, or 3. Someone else had given Emile the poison. The prosecution didn't have a clear answer. They simply argued she must have found a way. The letters were devastating, but complicated. Yes, they proved an affair. Yes, they showed Madeleine desperately wanted the relationship to end. But they also showed something else. In several letters from early March, right around the time she was buying arsenic, Madeleine was still arranging to meet Emile. Why? If she was planning to kill him, why keep seeing him? The prosecution's answer: to administer the poison in person. But Madeleine's defense would argue she was trying to reason with him, to convince him to return the letters, to avoid scandal. Neither explanation could be proven. Emile had written "saw Mimi. Felt very ill after in February. And just Mimi on the night he died." That seemed damning. But here's what complicated it. Emile's handwriting in that final entry was shaky. Unclear. It could have been written in distress, or it could have been written earlier in the day before he even became ill. The diary didn't include timestamps. And there was no proof he'd actually seen Madeleine that night. No one had seen them together. No servant had let him in. No neighbor had spotted him near her house. The Crown's case rested on the assumption that they'd met secretly, as they had before, but there was no physical evidence of it. The autopsy was clear: Emile died of arsenic poisoning. But the defense raised a critical question. Could he have taken it himself? Emile L'Angelier had a documented history of dabbling in medicine and chemistry. He had once worked in a pharmacy. He had access to chemicals. Some witnesses claimed he talked about suicide in the past, particularly after arguments with Madeleine. Could he have poisoned himself, either intentionally or accidentally, to manipulate her? To make her feel guilty? To force her to stay? It sounds extreme. But emotionally volatile people do extreme things. The prosecution dismissed this theory, but they couldn't entirely disprove it. Here's where things get really murky. Emile died in the early morning of March 23rd. The last confirmed sighting of him was around 9 p.m. on March 22nd, when he left his boarding house. If Madeleine poisoned him, it had to happen between 9 p.m. and midnight, when he returned home ill. But Madeleine's family testified she was home that entire evening. Her father, her sister, the servants, all said she never left the house. Could they have been lying to protect her? Possibly. But the prosecution had no evidence of that. And in a Scottish court, the burden of proof was on the Crown. The defense also pointed out that Emile could have ingested arsenic earlier in the day, and it simply took hours to affect him. Arsenic poisoning doesn't always act immediately. If that were true, Madeleine didn't need to see him that night at all. Again, neither side could prove it definitively. The prosecution tried to paint Madeleine as cold, calculating, unfeminine. They pointed to her explicit letters as evidence of moral depravity. But the defense flipped it. They argued Madeleine was a victim. A young woman seduced and manipulated by an older, predatory man. A man who groomed her, isolated her, and then threatened her when she tried to escape. They painted Emile as controlling, obsessive, possibly unhinged. And in Victorian Scotland, that narrative had power. Because the idea of a fallen woman redeemed versus a dangerous foreigner corrupting an innocent girl resonated deeply with the jury. By the time the trial reached its final days, the case was no longer clear-cut. Yes, Madeleine had bought arsenic. Yes, she'd had motive. But the Crown couldn't prove she'd administered the poison. Couldn't prove she'd seen him that night. Couldn't prove he hadn't taken it himself. And now, the entire case would be decided in a single room. By 15 men who had to weigh not just the evidence, but what kind of story they believed. To understand the trial of Madeleine Smith, you have to understand the people at its center, not as heroes or villains, but as human beings trapped in a system that gave them almost no room to maneuver. Let's start with Emile L'Angelier. The prosecution painted him as an innocent victim. The defense painted him as a manipulative predator. The truth, as always, was more complex. Emile was a romantic. By all accounts, he believed deeply in love, in passion, in the grand gestures of European courtship. He wrote poetry. He spoke of destiny. But he was also insecure. He was 30 years old, working a middling clerical job with no real wealth or status. In class-obsessed Victorian Britain, that mattered. He knew he was beneath Madeleine's social station. He knew her family would never accept him. That insecurity manifested as control. He kept her letters, more than 200 of them, as security. He threatened to expose her if she left. He wrote obsessively about his suffering, his heartbreak, his devotion. From a modern psychological perspective, this looks like emotional manipulation. In his mind, it may have felt like desperation. Did he love her? Probably. Did that love become toxic? Almost certainly. Could he have taken arsenic himself, either to punish Madeleine, to make her stay, or even in a moment of genuine despair? It's not impossible. Suicidal gestures designed to manipulate a partner are well documented, even in the 19th century. And Emile had made vague references to death in some of his letters. But we'll never know for sure. Now, Madeleine. The public saw her in two opposing ways. To some, she was a cold-blooded killer. A woman who used her beauty and charm to seduce, then destroy. Unfeminine. Unnatural. To others, she was a victim. A girl trapped by her gender, her class, and a man who wouldn't let her go. So who was she really? Based on her letters, our most direct window into her mind, Madeleine was intelligent, articulate, and deeply aware of her limited options. She loved the romance of the affair with Emile, the secrecy, the rebellion. But she also understood, coldly and clearly, that marrying him would mean social exile. Her family would disown her. She'd lose everything. When William Minnock appeared, stable, wealthy, acceptable, she made a calculated choice. And when Emile refused to let her go quietly, she panicked. Does panic lead to murder? Sometimes. But Madeleine's behavior in the weeks before Emile's death doesn't fit a clear pattern. She kept writing to him, kept arranging meetings. In some letters, she was conciliatory, in others, frustrated. If she was planning his death, she was either extraordinarily disciplined, or she wasn't planning it at all. And then there's the arsenic. Buying it under her real name, in her own neighborhood, signing the register in her own handwriting. If she was planning murder, it was either remarkably brazen or remarkably careless. Or it really was for rats. The prosecution's theory required Madeleine to be both coldly calculating and recklessly sloppy. That's psychologically possible, but inconsistent. What about the investigators? The Glasgow police were under immense pressure. This was a high-profile case. A wealthy family. A scandalous affair. The press was watching. They built their case quickly, maybe too quickly. They had the letters. They had the arsenic purchases. They had the motive. But they never found hard proof of administration. They never found witnesses to the final meeting. They never definitively ruled out suicide or accident. Did they ignore alternative theories because they were so sure she was guilty? Possibly. And then there's the jury. 15 men. All male. Women couldn't serve on juries in Scotland until the 20th century. All middle or upper class. All shaped by Victorian ideas about gender, morality, and respectability. They had to decide, was Madeleine Smith a murderer or a victim of circumstances? But they also had to decide, what kind of woman was she? And in 1857 Scotland, that question mattered more than we'd like to admit. Because here's the reframing insight that changes everything. The not proven verdict wasn't just about evidence. It was a moral compromise. The jury didn't want to say she was innocent because they weren't sure she was. But they also didn't want to hang a beautiful, educated young woman from a respected family based on circumstantial evidence. Not proven allowed them to express doubt without acquitting her. To condemn her socially without convicting her legally. It was Scotland's way of saying, we think you probably did it, but we can't prove it, and we're not willing to kill you over it. And that verdict, more than anything, reveals the deep discomfort at the heart of this case. Because if Madeleine Smith was guilty, the system failed to convict her. And if she was innocent, the system destroyed her reputation anyway. Either way, justice wasn't served. And all of this came to a head when the verdict was read. The trial of Madeleine Smith lasted 9 days. It was held in Edinburgh's High Court of Justiciary, Scotland's Supreme Criminal Court, equivalent to England's Old Bailey. The courtroom was packed. Spectators lined up hours before the doors opened. Journalists from across Britain filled the press gallery. Madeleine sat in the dock, composed. Dressed in black, as was customary. Her expression calm, almost detached. Her defense, led by the famous advocate John Inglis, was masterful. Inglis didn't deny the affair. He couldn't, the letters were public. Instead, he reframed the entire narrative. He portrayed Madeleine as a naive girl seduced by a manipulative older man. A man who had taken advantage of her youth and inexperience. A man who, when rejected, had threatened to destroy her. He argued that Emile L'Angelier was unstable, obsessive, possibly suicidal. He pointed out the lack of direct evidence. No witness placed Madeleine with Emile on the night of March 22nd. No proof she'd administered poison. No confession. And he hammered on reasonable doubt. If there is any possibility at all, that this man took his own life, or ingested poison by accident, or received it from another hand, then you cannot, in good conscience, convict this woman. The prosecution, led by the Lord Advocate, countered hard. They emphasized the arsenic purchases, the motive, the timing, the incriminating letters. They called medical experts who testified that the amount of arsenic in Emile's body made suicide unlikely. It would have been agonizing, and he would have needed to ingest it multiple times. But they had no smoking gun. No servant testified to seeing Madeleine sneak out. No chemist testified to selling her pure, undyed arsenic. No confession. After 9 days of testimony, the case went to the jury. In Scotland, criminal juries have 3 verdict options. Guilty, conviction beyond reasonable doubt. Not guilty, innocence established, or prosecution failed to prove guilt. Not proven, somewhere in between. Legally equivalent to acquittal, but morally ambiguous. The jury deliberated for less than 30 minutes. When they returned, the foreman read the verdict. Not proven. The courtroom erupted. Some spectators cheered. Others jeered. Madeleine showed no reaction. She was free, but she was not vindicated. The immediate aftermath. Madeleine Smith walked out of the High Court a free woman, but she was also a pariah. The verdict meant she couldn't be tried again. Double jeopardy laws protected her. But not proven carried a stigma that not guilty did not. It implied guilt without consequences. The press had a field day. Some papers called her a manipulative seductress who'd escaped justice. Others called her a tragic victim of a broken man and an unjust system. Her family, horrified by the scandal, distanced themselves. Her engagement to William Minnock was quietly dissolved. He wanted nothing to do with her. Madeleine left Scotland. She moved to London first, then later to the United States, where she remarried twice. She never spoke publicly about the trial. Never wrote a memoir. Never gave an interview. In her later years, living in New York under a different name, she became something of a recluse. She died on April 12, 1928, at the age of 93. The official cause of death: natural causes. To the end, she maintained her silence. The legal and cultural legacy. The Madeleine Smith case became a landmark in Scottish legal history, not because it clarified the law, but because it exposed its contradictions. The not proven verdict remains unique to Scotland. It exists nowhere else in the common law world. Supporters argue it allows juries to express doubt when evidence is insufficient, better than forcing them to choose between guilty and not guilty when neither feels right. Critics argue it's a cop-out, a way to condemn someone socially without convicting them legally. A verdict that protects juries from tough decisions, but leaves defendants in permanent limbo. Madeleine's case fueled both arguments, and it raised uncomfortable questions about gender, class, and credibility. Would a working-class woman have received the same benefit of the doubt? Would a man, especially a foreign man, have been acquitted on such circumstantial evidence? The case also exposed the double standard around female sexuality. Madeleine's explicit letters shocked Victorian society. They were read aloud in court, published in newspapers, analyzed in drawing rooms across Britain. For many, the letters alone proved her depravity. A good woman wouldn't write such things. Therefore, she must be capable of murder. But that logic is circular and dangerous. It conflates sexual agency with criminality. It assumes that a woman who breaks one social rule is capable of breaking all of them. Modern legal scholars see the Madeleine Smith trial as a case study in how moral judgments distort justice. What do we actually know? Let's strip away speculation and focus on facts. Madeleine Smith purchased arsenic 3 times in the weeks before Emile's death. Confirmed. Emile L'Angelier died of arsenic poisoning. Confirmed. Madeleine had a clear motive to want Emile out of her life. Confirmed. Emile kept Madeleine's letters as leverage and threatened to expose her. Confirmed. No witness saw Madeleine administer poison to Emile. Confirmed. No physical evidence directly linked Madeleine to the poison in Emile's body. Confirmed. Emile had been ill multiple times before his death, suggesting repeated poisoning, or repeated ingestion by some other means. Confirmed. Emile had access to chemicals and had spoken vaguely of death before. Confirmed. So what happened? 3 main theories persist. Theory 1. Madeleine poisoned him. She bought arsenic. She had motive. She had opportunity during their secret meetings. She administered it gradually, testing doses, until the final fatal cup of cocoa. The not proven verdict suggests the jury suspected this but couldn't prove it. Theory 2. Emile poisoned himself. Driven by despair, or as a manipulative gesture to guilt Madeleine into staying, he ingested arsenic, possibly not intending to die but miscalculating the dose. The repeated illnesses support this. So does his documented emotional volatility. Theory 3. Someone else poisoned him. Less likely, but not impossible. Emile had other acquaintances. He worked in shipping and moved in social circles. Could someone else have had a grudge? There's no evidence for this, but there's also no evidence ruling it out. We will never know for certain. Madeleine took her silence to the grave. And the evidence, compelling as it is, stops just short of proof. Final reflection. The Madeleine Smith case doesn't just ask whether one woman was guilty of murder. It asks deeper questions. How certain is certain enough to take a life? What happens when the justice system must choose between a bad verdict and no verdict at all? And how do we separate moral judgment from legal judgment when the two are so easily confused? In 1857, a jury decided that doubt, however slight, was enough to spare Madeleine Smith's life. They couldn't say she was innocent, but they wouldn't say she was guilty. And so she walked free, into a life marked forever by suspicion. The house on Blythswood Square still stands in Glasgow. You can visit it. The courtroom in Edinburgh still hears cases. The letters, those intimate, damning, heartbreaking letters, are preserved in archives, available to researchers. But the truth of what happened on the night of March 22, 1857? That remains locked in history. Not guilty, not innocent, not proven. And perhaps, in the end, that's the most haunting verdict of all. Subscribe to Enter the Crime for more global true crime documentaries told with depth, respect, and investigative rigor. Let us know in the comments, what do you think happened?